He dedicated his life to upholding the law, but when his disabled daughter was shot by the very police he trusted, what happened next changed everything. The sun had just begun to set over the quiet suburban neighborhood when Special Agent David Reynolds received the call that would shatter his world. For over 20 years, David had served with the FBI, dedicated to protecting the very fabric of law and order. He'd seen the worst of humanity, criminals, corruption, and chaos. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen in his own backyard. His 17-year-old daughter, Emma, born with cerebral palsy, was the light of his life. Despite her physical challenges, she radiated warmth and resilience, never letting her condition define her. She moved through life in her custom wheelchair, often accompanied by her service dog, Max. That evening, Emma had gone out for her usual evening stroll around the neighborhood park, a routine she'd done countless times before. But as David's phone rang, and he saw the caller ID from the local police department, a chill ran down his spine. "Mr. Reynolds?" the officer on the line began, his voice tense. "There's been an incident involving your daughter." David's heart stopped. "What kind of incident?" he demanded, already grabbing his car keys, his FBI instincts kicking in. "She's been shot," the officer said hesitantly. "We need you to come down to the hospital immediately." The words echoed in David's mind as he sped down the highway, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Shot? How could that even be possible? Emma couldn't even walk. How could she pose a threat to anyone? When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled his lungs as he rushed through the emergency room doors. There, in a sterile white bed, lay Emma, her fragile body connected to monitors, a bandage over her shoulder where the bullet had torn through her skin. But it wasn't just the sight of his daughter that shattered him. It was the two uniformed officers standing at the foot of her bed, their faces pale and their eyes darting nervously as they saw David enter. "What happened?" David barked, his voice sharper than he intended. The officers exchanged a quick glance before one of them, Officer Jenkins, finally spoke. "There was a call about a suspicious person in the park," Jenkins began. "When we arrived, we saw someone matching the description. She didn't respond to our commands to stop. She reached into her bag, and we thought she was armed." David stared at them, disbelief washing over him. "She's disabled. She can't even lift her arm properly. And you thought she was a threat?" The room went silent. But what the officers said next would uncover a truth so shocking it would change David's life and the entire department forever. Officer Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to his partner, Officer Blake, who stood stiffly beside him. The air in the hospital room felt suffocating, the steady beep of Emma's heart monitor the only sound cutting through the tension. "We didn't know she was disabled," Jenkins muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was dark, and when she reached into her bag, we thought she had a weapon." David's heart pounded in his chest, rage and disbelief battling for dominance. "Her bag," he repeated, his voice rising. "You shot a disabled teenager because she reached into her bag?" Blake finally spoke, his tone defensive. "We followed protocol. She didn't comply with verbal commands. We had to make a split-second decision." David's eyes burned with fury. "She didn't comply because she can't hear well. She's partially deaf, you idiots." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. The officers' faces paled further, realizing the gravity of their mistake. But David wasn't done. "What exactly did she pull out of her bag?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Jenkins swallowed hard. "It was a snack, a granola bar." For a moment, David felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. His daughter, a sweet, defenseless girl who posed no threat to anyone, had been shot because she reached for a granola bar. But it got worse. Jenkins hesitated, then added, "The call we responded to? It came from an anonymous tip. Someone said there was a suspicious black teenager in the park acting strangely." David's breath caught in his throat. Racial profiling. His mind raced. He had spent his entire career fighting crime, believing in the justice system, trusting that law enforcement worked to protect the innocent. But here he was, standing in a hospital room, staring at the very system he had dedicated his life to, the same system that had just nearly killed his daughter. "I want to see the body cam footage," David growled, his FBI badge flashing as he pulled it from his pocket. "Now." The officers hesitated, exchanging another nervous glance. "There's a problem with the footage," Blake finally admitted. "The body cams were malfunctioning." David's blood ran cold. Malfunctioning? He'd heard that excuse before, too many times in cases that involved police misconduct. But this time, it wasn't just another case file. It was his daughter. His mind snapped into agent mode. They were covering something up. What he uncovered next would send shockwaves through the entire department and would change the course of his life forever. David stared at the officers, his jaw clenched so tight he could feel the tension pulsing in his temples. "Malfunctioning?" he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. In his 2 decades with the FBI, David had heard that excuse more times than he could count, almost always in cases where officers had something to hide. But this time, it wasn't a stranger. It was his daughter. "I want the footage pulled from the server," David ordered, his FBI badge still in hand. "You know it's automatically backed up, even if your camera's malfunctioned." The officers exchanged another nervous glance. Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but David cut him off. "Save it," he snapped. "If I find out you tampered with evidence, it won't just be your jobs on the line, it'll be your freedom." Before they could respond, David stormed out of the hospital room, his mind racing. He didn't just want answers, he wanted justice. By the time David arrived at the police precinct, his FBI credentials had already opened doors. He was met by Captain Miller, the head of the local department, who greeted him with a tense, apologetic smile. "Agent Reynolds, I'm so sorry about what happened," Miller began, his tone overly rehearsed. "It's an unfortunate misunderstanding." David cut him off immediately. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Captain. Your officers shot my disabled daughter over a granola bar. I want the body cam footage now." Miller hesitated, his confident facade slipping for a brief moment. "We're still reviewing." "I'm not asking," David barked. "I'm telling you." Reluctantly, Miller led David to a small room where the body cam footage was stored. As the screen flickered to life, David braced himself for what he was about to see. But nothing could have prepared him for the truth. The footage showed Emma, alone in the park, her wheelchair slowly rolling down the familiar path. Her service dog, Max, trotted faithfully beside her. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the playground equipment. Then came the officers, Jenkins and Blake, their voices barking out commands. "Stop right there! Hands where we can see them!" Emma, unable to hear properly and confused by the sudden shouting, reached into her bag, slowly, cautiously. That's when the unthinkable happened. Without hesitation, Blake fired his weapon, the shot echoing through the park. Emma's body jerked as the bullet struck her shoulder, her wheelchair tipping slightly from the force. Max barked frantically, circling her in panic. But what chilled David to the bone wasn't just the shooting, it was what happened after. "Damn," Blake muttered on the footage, his voice low. "Didn't realize she was like that." "Doesn't matter," Jenkins replied quickly, glancing around. "We'll say she looked armed. Body cams glitched, remember?" David's heart pounded in his chest. They knew. They knew they had shot an innocent, disabled girl, and their first instinct was to cover it up. He turned to Captain Miller, his eyes burning with fury. "Explain that." Miller paled, his mouth opening and closing without any words forming. David didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his phone and dialed his supervisor at the FBI. "I need Internal Affairs and the Justice Department on this immediately," he said. "I'm launching a federal investigation into the shooting of my daughter and potential evidence tampering by the local police." This wasn't just about Emma anymore. This was about exposing a systemic problem, one that went deeper than he'd ever imagined, and David was ready to take them all down. The days following the shooting were a whirlwind of media frenzy, legal maneuvering, and internal investigations. The story of an FBI agent's disabled daughter being shot by local police officers wasn't just a headline, it became a national outcry. David watched as his private pain became public discourse. News channels replayed the footage repeatedly, each broadcast stirring outrage across the country. The hashtags #Justice for Emma and #Accountability Now trended globally. But for David, it wasn't about the media, it was about his daughter. Emma was still in the hospital, her recovery slow but steady. Her fragile body bore the physical scars, but it was the emotional trauma that haunted David the most. She had always been a symbol of resilience, but now her bright spirit seemed dimmed, her once cheerful eyes clouded with confusion and fear. But David wasn't just a grieving father. He was an FBI agent, and he knew how to navigate the very system that had tried to betray him. The federal investigation moved swiftly. With overwhelming evidence from the body cam footage and the officer's attempted cover-up, both Officer Jenkins and Officer Blake were arrested and charged with assault, reckless endangerment, and evidence tampering. But David wasn't satisfied with just their arrests. He wanted to expose the entire system that allowed this to happen. During the investigation, shocking revelations emerged. The anonymous tip that led officers to the park? It came from a neighbor who had repeatedly called the police about Emma, claiming she looked suspicious because of her wheelchair and erratic behavior. Captain Miller had a history of overlooking misconduct in his department, with multiple prior complaints about racial profiling and excessive force that had been quietly swept under the rug. The department's body cam policy had loopholes that made it easy for officers to claim technical malfunctions when footage incriminated them. David knew this wasn't just about two bad cops, it was about a broken system. The case went to trial, and the courtroom was packed with media, activists, and members of the community. David testified, his voice steady as he recounted the horrifying details of his daughter's shooting. But what moved the courtroom the most was when Emma took the stand. Wheeling herself into the room, Emma faced the officers who had shot her. Her voice was soft, but her words were powerful. "I don't understand why you were afraid of me," she said quietly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just wanted to eat my snack and enjoy the park. But now, I'm scared to go outside. I'm scared of people who are supposed to protect me." The room was silent, many wiping away tears. Even the jury looked visibly shaken. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. Both officers were found guilty on all charges. They were sentenced to prison, and Captain Miller was forced to resign in disgrace. But David's mission wasn't over. In the aftermath of the trial, David used the national spotlight to push for systemic changes. He partnered with advocacy groups to draft legislation for 1. Stricter body cam regulations, ensuring footage couldn't be tampered with or erased. 2. Mandatory bias training for all law enforcement officers, focusing on interactions with disabled and minority communities. 3. Stronger accountability measures for police departments, making it harder to sweep misconduct under the rug. The bill, named the Emma Reynolds Law, passed with overwhelming support, becoming a symbol of hope and change for communities across the country. Months later, as David wheeled Emma through the now peaceful park, he glanced down at her, a mix of pride and pain in his heart. "You changed everything, sweetheart," he whispered. "You made sure no one else will have to go through what we did." Emma looked up at her father, a small smile breaking through the lingering sadness in her eyes. "We did it, Dad," she whispered back. "Together." And as they sat in the park, watching the sunset, David knew that while their journey had been filled with pain, it had also sparked a movement that would protect countless others. His daughter had been the victim of a broken system, but together they became the catalysts for change. Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice that changed your perspective? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this.